I'm Kim Stevenson. I'm the CIO at Intel, and I have the honor of moderating our panel here this evening as the wrap-up. So hopefully we're going to make it a little provocative and give you some food for thought as we end the day. So I think you've probably met everybody, so I'm not going to go through long bios as we went through the day, but just give you a sense of who we have at the table. We have Cesar Baldwin from the World Bank. He's the chief architect. We have Greg Fittinghoff, who is the acting CIO for the Fashion Institute of Technology. Warren Cudman, who is the CIO for Turner Construction, and Robin Ben Fife, who is the with Samsung Electronics, the Executive Vice President for Innovation. So, and what we wanted to spend time with the panel, and we'll have plenty of time to take your Q&A, is sort of the changing world that we sit in, right? So business is moving at an ever-increasing pace, largely driven by technology, which makes it sort of one of the best times ever to be a technology professional, but it also presents some challenges. And there's lots of debate in the industry about the role of the CIO going forward in the future. As business IT spending continues to increase, companies keep appointing chief data officers, chief digitization officers. We have a workforce that have been born as digital natives. So it really creates a dynamic environment where the responsibilities of the CIO are changing. Couple that with, as a profession, our profession tends to be a younger profession than most C-level executives. So as long as there's been businesses, there's been chief financial officers. And as long as there's been competition, there's been chief legal officers or general counsels. And those jobs are, chief sales officers, et cetera. They're fairly well defined. And what you find with a CIO role in the IT organization, that the scope and definition of that varies significantly industry to industry, company to company. So that adds an added complexity to the role. So I thought I would start in academia as the source of our talent comes out. And Greg, at the Fashion Institute, I'm interested in how technology is fitting into the curriculum and as you guys develop students to go in the workforce and wearables and fashion tech start to become commonplace, where do you see that fit and how it will impact the role of the CIO?
We roll the clock back a little bit, and you had 3D printing coming out. And so the question becomes then, how does one deal with 3D printing and thinking about it from the standpoint of manufacturer or something else? Guess what? Shoes are both fashion and something that you manufacture. Accessories are something that you both manufacture and can create out of 3D printers. So 3D printing was actually brought into the curriculum and is part of classes taught how to be able to use this. As a matter of fact, the fashion show that just finished was last week down at FIT, where they have major external designers, Calvin Klein, others that are there, that are juried and looking at the fashions. Many of the apparel, the shoes, the accessories, were created using 3D printing. So you have to bring those in. And the next generation of things that you're talking about when we talk about wearables is there is actually an article that was done, maybe it was in February, that talked about the problem that was happening with how do you take the new generation of things that are about wearable technology and integrate them into the fashion world so that they become a seamless part of it. And so running forward with that is that there is some NYC Manufacturing, which is a consortium, there's some businesses out in Brooklyn, some startups that are actually taking and doing that kind of stuff of taking wearables and integrating them into fashion. Now, that is outside of the area of education and preparing students. So now let's take this back. As I've spent a lot of years on the commercial side before coming over to the higher ed, one of the things that was always very difficult is finding talented, capable people. And so you would be like, oh, I wish that they would just teach this kind of stuff in the schools so that when they're coming out, they have some base of experience to be able to help us. Well, that's exactly what FIT is looking to start addressing, is to start saying, how do we incorporate into the curriculum classes and things about wearables that you would include as part of the educating of the students for design? How do you design something to include this? And you would have to talk about partnerships with other organizations, could be the Intels, others that are doing, what are the sensors? What are the things that need to be included, but having that conversation. And so when it comes to how does that fit in with the technology and the CIO role within FIT is the direction of how we start talking about these pieces of technology and enabling the classroom to have that starts with how do we enable that kind of technology? How do we facilitate having the types of systems or services available so that if you wanted to go ahead and have a sensor and put it in, who are we partnering with to get the sensors? How are we making them available so that the students and the faculty can start experimenting? So our role becomes one, as it should be, is facilitation. How do we facilitate to ensure that they have access to the technology to start talking about how to start incorporating that, how to start building on that for both curriculum? At the end of the day, institutions like FIT are focused on very specific areas, and they're preparing students to go out and have and be a designer for fashion, be someone who's actually creating fashion, someone who's doing household things, and also the business and technology of running fashion. And so being able to give them exposure to these types of technologies is a key part of what is being asked of me as the CIO, is to help bring that stuff in and to make it available for the faculty and students. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, so you said you have to forge new partnerships in this world as it changes, and Intel has forged partnerships with a number of fashion houses, and it's uncomfortable for us. We know nothing about fashion, but we know a lot about computing, and so it's been a really interesting, and we've gotten products out, so the Fossil watch and the opening ceremony bracelet, and we've got a number of products that have gone to market from low end to high end, but it's a huge learning curve to work in a different, to apply your technology core to a different industry. So,
Absolutely.
so having these students come out with that knowledge base today, I think, enables a more productive workforce down the future.
That's the key thing. The partnership between industry and academia has to be something where we're actually preparing the students to go out and immediately not only be able to have jobs, but immediately have the skills that are going to enable them to help drive their companies they're joining to the next level.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they come out and they've got a set of generalized skills, but no one's there that's coming in with the immediate need, the immediate knowledge of how to do something. So there's a lot of hunting and pecking going on by the companies to try and figure out how to do some of this.
Yeah, yeah. So Warren, I want to turn to you because Greg said something about 3D printing, and when I typically think of construction, I wouldn't say construction is a place that has in the history inspired a lot of great technical innovations and use of technology. But we were talking earlier, and you were explaining a number of changes is happening in the construction industry that are technology driven. So can you talk a little bit about the impact on your company and therefore the change in the role of the CIO because of that?
Sure. There may be somebody else in the audience that's from construction, at least there was this morning, but I think construction has been viewed as a laggard with a lot of digital technology adoption. And if you look at some government statistics on productivity in different industries, you would find that the construction industry has been flat from a productivity perspective for decades and decades, and it has probably been the least productive industry that's measured. But what has happened probably within the past 10 years, certainly within the past 3 or 4, is there is a tremendous amount of transition to digital. So if you look at a building like this and all the complexities of putting up a one-off 40, 50-story building with all the fittings that go inside, all of that now is being modeled virtually. before a contract is ever signed, before a shovel ever goes in the dirt, all the different layers and components and intricacies of the building can be modeled. So it has the advantages of being able to identify challenges that might not be discovered until you're building a one-off building, and resolving all of these conflicts and potential quality issues before they ever arise. So for example, you think about duct work and electrical work and plumbing, very often it used to not be discovered until you were in the middle of the building that somebody's hot water line was going to run right through the middle of the air conditioning ductwork. Well, now all of that can be resolved in advance, and those models can now be shared across all the various stakeholders that go into putting up a building, which is another interesting challenge in construction, is that there are so many stakeholders involved in a given project: the owner, the architect, the specialized engineers, the general contractor that Turner is, all of the subcontractors, and you're trying to coordinate all of those stakeholders effectively minute by minute on a very complex effort. And whenever there's a question or a problem, if all the stakeholders aren't aligned and looking at the single same source of truth, and then when that gets modified, everybody knows it immediately, you run into challenges and you run into mistakes and you run into errors. So the virtual design, as well as digitizing all of the documentation and workflow that goes into keeping the communications across all of those stakeholders flowing smoothly and keeping everybody, again, on the same page, it's a significant advance for the construction industry. I would say as well, again, picking off from what we were talking about before, I think construction in particular was waiting for mobile and cloud, because all of our work doesn't happen in our offices, it happens out in the field somewhere. And so when we have all of the stakeholders not in their offices, but together on a project site, our ability now to access all of that data and do it through very portable devices also, once again, allows us to communicate much more quickly, to resolve problems, and to share information in a much more rapid fashion. So it is very significant for us. And all of these young kids, again, that come out of college from their engineering classes or schools, they are very, very equipped and ready to adopt these technologies.
Does that give you a generational divide in the workforce that poses challenges for you as the CIO?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we are bipolar. So you have people who are longtime builders who were able to execute all of these things, right, for over 100 years, and they did it without all of this great technology. So they look around and they think, why do we need to spend this money? I can get this done with my slide rule and my paper, and my 5,000 sheet architectural drawings. So the role that my team has migrated toward is to become almost the cheerleaders for the young folks, who are the ones on the front line who are doing all the experimenting and finding new ways to adopt technology to improve the building process. We can't keep up with 5,000 engineers. We are not that big and we are not that distributed. So we have to be cheerleaders and engage all of those engineers and be the glue that brings all of their innovation and experimentation together.
Yeah, it's interesting because so maybe not all in construction, but Turner has built buildings for Intel, so thank you for that.
My pleasure.
But what I really see, the commonality is this multifunctional collaboration that has to happen. In your world, it might be plumbers and concrete pourers and GCs and architects and stuff. In our world, it might be different kinds of engineers with salespeople. But the need for common communication, everyone being grounded in the same thing, so using the same collaboration tools across that with a single source of the truth, with the latest direction, whatever it might be, I think actually is a pretty common problem across companies. So.
Yeah, I understand. I think maybe what's a little bit different for us is the supply chain across all those stakeholders is still not as, let's say, as integrated and cooperative as you might find in high-tech supply chains, manufacturing supply chains, auto. We still have some way to go.
Yeah. All right, so let's go to high-tech. Robin. So you're the Chief Innovation officer and been the CIO at a number of different companies.
Correct.
Before that. So I have two questions. The first one is keeping innovation going at a pace that the business can, helps the business to accelerate. So do you have any advice for the audience on how to do that when I'll assert that most of us run with tight budgets and more or less, in a short-term sense, fixed skill sets. So how do we keep that innovation engine going?
Well, that's a real broad subject, but still, I would give you a couple of pieces of advice. I've, in my days of BlackBerry, they had so much innovation going on, they couldn't get the product out the door. So I would tell you, you have to limit a little bit of your innovation so that you can produce something in a timely way, so that you can be responsible or responsive to the marketplace. The innovation side of things at Samsung, since they're an open source, open ecosystem, and they embrace partners, they look for innovation not only inside but outside the company. They look at how people are using the devices, the displays, the watches, whatever it is that they're engaging with on that piece of glass. And the innovation may not be something you can actually see. The innovation may be with the radio antennas that are in the device, so that when you're moving between a 4G and now at some point in time 5G, or you're moving into Wi-Fi, that seamless move, you might not have seen the innovation that was created there, but there might be some at that level. All you feel is that ease transition from one space to the next, and no data disruption, or your application stays up and running and is not interrupted. And you as a user, your user experience gets better. From the constant churn of innovation, us as consumers, we're always looking for something to make our lives easier or simpler and actually more fun. So putting that entertainment side to your innovation can also enlist people within your organization to adopt new things or even think about new things. I always find that the innovative ideas usually aren't within the company. Sometimes they are, but Samsung builds teams that actually compete against each other. And there's winners and losers, but the losers are celebrated just as much as the winners, because it's some of the things that they may have tried to innovate might not make it this round of deployment, it'll make it next round of deployment. So that constant moving, constant rethinking, disrupting your own business before somebody else does it for you is a thinking, and it has to be part of the culture. Has to start from the top, has to kind of weed all the way through the different parts of the organization, and it's got to allow a lot of failing fast and learning, and then taking that to where you can deliver something creative out of the business.
So Robin, a few years ago, I was talking with the CEO of Ouya, which at the time, they were a small but fast-growing startup, had just released their first product, and it wasn't all that good. But his advice to me was, if your first product out the door doesn't embarrass you, you waited too long. And in the world of fast-changing consumer products, I can see that mental model.
Right, and there's a few that you could probably see in the marketplace, even in the Samsung space, that you're thinking, okay, why did they do that? Yeah. Or why do you want a curved screen? Or why do you want curve on the edge of your device? And the innovation there is they're learning how to bend glass. So you might not see the innovation of it being in a device, but they're learning how to bend glass and actually have the glass look and do things on the edge. And at some point in time, you might be able to roll that glass up or do some other things with that glass. And so it starts in phases, in small pieces, and small tests, and small deployments, and small efforts. But then it can actually grow into a larger innovative step.
And do you think in enterprise IT that we would benefit from adopting more of that mental model and changing sort of the, I think our view is we can't roll out a business process application unless we know it's going to work. We've got to be able to make sure it works.
I think it depends upon where you sit in the organization. Sometimes I've seen, in new jobs I've seen, where the IT or the CIO actually sits at the table with the CEO and the CMO, and they're all at one level. I see that they see the CIO as somebody who's got strategic value, and they're willing to allow that person to have some failures. In other cases, I've seen CIOs that sit underneath the CFO, and that means, oh, you know what, you're a cost organization, you tend to wind up having to police things. You had your budget cut 10% from last year, and you got to still do all the same things over again. And so if you have a failure, it's that horrible IT department, there again, can't deliver. So they're afraid. There's a lot of fear. So you have to sort of do something in the organization from the leadership level so that the IT department or the line of business can engage the IT department to learn and fail fast together. So there is no, ain't it awful that the IT department isn't delivering again.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, great, thank you. Caesar.
Yes.
So you run the architecture at the World Bank.
Yes.
And it's my belief that architecture is the foundation that allows a business to operate effectively and quickly. And as you look at the changes that are happening in architecture and the increasing of business IT or chief data officers being appointed that maybe are outside of IT, how do you think about the role of architecture in a more, I'll call it distributed technology environment?
So first, I guess I'll talk about my experience with the World Bank. So the World Bank, I report to the Chief Information Officer, Stephanie. And what I am is her eyes in the organization. So we define an architectural framework that is very similar to the TOGAF, that begins right at the top with the business process, understanding that every system that we put out there has some business process that needs to automate, support, and it then implies that data is flowing through that system.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to understand what the data is, and where the data is going to end up, and where the data is going to reside, and where the data will ultimately be stored or erased, and how our policies will apply to that. And finally, we look at user experience. The last thing we look at right now from an architecture perspective is the technology.
Yep.
Because solutions, infrastructure, technology, we will not outrun the internet. So there's companies out there that will do it faster and better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
User experience, our data, our business processes, not so much. So what we do is set up this architecture framework so that we can provide this data to the CIOs, so to the CIO, so that they know where the data is. So they know how to talk to a chief operating officer or to the treasurer or to the CFO or to the CTO to say, you know, this is the impact of the business decisions that you're making. And the impact is that if you're touching the front line, the middle office and the back office will have an impact. If you're touching this piece of data, this is what it means. And by the way, if you want to resolve that business problem, it is not just about so if you want to resolve talent management at the bank, it isn't about HR. Because talent impacts the front line. It impacts the actual lending that we do to our countries. So it starts with them. It's an IT issue because it's a system that needs to be developed, but it's also bringing HR together and saying, let's have a conversation of how we going to architect a solution that benefits all of us, and that we can do great business change management and make it successful.
Yeah, okay. So let me ask if there's any questions in the audience.
Probably told you no questions.
You mentioned something. We're all going through change, and our ecosystems are not quite at the same speed. What are you doing to kind of help that situation? Are you requiring your partners to have some minimal capabilities, or are you just dealing as is and just waiting for them to come up? What is the strategy?
So if I understand the question, so we have put in place a demand management process to kind of funnel and evaluate ideas that should be spread throughout the enterprise. And those things can happen because they're top-down requirements that come from the people that aren't necessarily quite as innovative or have been kind of locked into a model of doing things for a certain way for a long time. And then there are other things that come from that bottom-up experimentation and innovating that somebody decides, should scale for the benefit of the entire enterprise. And we have to, so there's a pace of change that's happening on the front lines. A lot of experimentation all over the place. If we have 1,500 projects going at any one time, there's probably a few hundred of them at any one time that are trying something that no other project has tried before from an IT perspective, because the amount of solutions being introduced into our industry right now are just, it's just an incredibly rapid pace. So there's that pace of change, and when we look at what we might do in terms of keeping and evolving the traditional systems of record and having a pace of change for that versus the pace of change of piloting and then introducing things that are used on the front line where you can experiment more freely and there's less risk of failure at the same time, we can do those sorts of things, while the system of record, we're a little bit more traditional in terms of how we evaluate, how we introduce change, how we test those changes into the environment, right? So having said all that, the folks that have been in the business for a long time are still learning to cope with the younger folks who are just really comfortable and see a bright, shiny object in front of them and want to try it. And for better or for worse, our management team has said, we want the front line to innovate. We might not always understand what they're doing, but we want them to innovate because they may have a need on their particular project that we have never seen before. And if they can find a solution to make that project better, faster, easier, go for it. So ultimately what we try to do is again, engage with all of that experimentation, and when it's time to scale, we will help it scale. I don't know if that answered the question.
So I've got 10,000 innovators that every day are looking for how they're going to do something, how they're going to perform against class objectives, how they're going to leapfrog over somebody and make something look better. And so I think that it's inherent in when we talk about the role of the CIO as we go forward is that embracing the idea that innovation is not going to come solely from a technology group. So we have to be able to embrace the fact that technology is going to come from a whole different areas of the organization. It's how do we funnel those thoughts, and how can we see if we can have them either rise to the top, fail quickly, but understand why they failed, but maybe it's the wrong timing, but be able to make sure that we have a mechanism, not a bureaucracy, but a mechanism to be able to funnel that, because otherwise we as CIOs look to be the dinosaurs in the past. The central IT function becomes something that's an obstacle, and instead of being an enabler. And that's the constant focus. We have to be enablers, and that means part of the organization, I think it's been referenced before, part of the organization is focused on being able to keep the operation, the lights on, the standard piece of it, and that's treated as a cost center. And then there's a part of the IT that has to be focused on how they're partnering with this R&D, with this innovation, and how they're building that kind of credibility and that partnership to be able to work on them with. Because if you're not part of it, they're just going around you. To think it's not happening is the wrong idea.
The
Let me add to the
ambidextrous
ecosystem.
organization,
Let
right?
me add to the ecosystem. So
Yep.
the bank has an issue. We need to collect data, a lot of data from household surveys to understand where poverty, where health issues, where child issues happen. So what we're trying to do is innovate with the business and using things like Hadoop, Cloudera, big data to not have to do surveys. They cost a lot of money. They take a lot of time. They will take us a long time to then respond. And so how do we do this is one of the areas that we've taken from an innovation perspective. We heard internal. We had our partners. What we've done is now for 3 years in a row go to Silicon Valley. We visited Anderson Horowitz, we did visit Sequoia, and a couple of other venture capitalists to understand where they are investing, where they see trends coming, and then how those might apply to the challenges that we are facing. One of them, for example, was our purchasing of box licenses. Just so you know, we've been doing records management for many years. We didn't have a solution to put a file on a mobile device. And we have 30% of our staff somewhere in the world connected, and so we needed to find a solution. So 3 years ago, we went ahead and put Box and said, you know what, we're going to see what it's going to be like. We put it out there, and the adoption has been tremendous.
Yeah, I also do the we're in the Valley, but I still do at least once a year technology days where I get the VC firms to parade through their portfolio companies based on a set of topics that we deem important to Intel. So I would recommend, I think that's a best practice, and it's as much to learn what you're not going to do as to learn what you should be doing. So I think there was a question back here.
Yeah, I'd be interested in it because from a strategic standpoint, the CIO has to support innovation. If you don't innovate, you're going to die. But from a practical standpoint, we also live in an environment now where security is part of our everyday life. And being in the healthcare space, something as simple as we have people that want to innovate and install software that's not been vetted yet. So we have to have those controls in place so we protect patient health information, yet we want to give people an opportunity to innovate. Can you speak to where you strike that balance?
You want to go first, Warren?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we don't have the same challenges as in a regulated industry like healthcare, but this is exactly what we're working on right now. So what we've said is, yes, we have to have guardrails and some degree of governance, even around innovation. And as long as you meet these criteria or you're safely within these guardrails, you're going to be allowed to innovate. But there do have to be a few non-negotiables. And as long as it's transparent and clear, so I'll give you an example. We had a group that, again, a new cloud vendor came out and it was, you know what, you can even use this for free. Because
Because we're
right,
collecting your data.
free. Yeah, exactly. So they wanted to collect our data. And when you looked at the terms and conditions on the click-through, it was, we can do whatever the hell we want with your data. We can post it publicly. We can use it for our own business purposes. And we had a group of people that said, we love the functionality and it's free. And in a business where our margins are like this and you hear free, right, it's, you run to the bright, shiny light. So we were plugged into that. We looked at the terms and conditions. We said, absolutely not. We spent 3 months negotiating with the vendor on the right terms and conditions, and then we turned it back loose to the organization to give it a shot. But, those, security, privacy, making sure certain fundamental aspects of putting the company at risk are accounted for, and then you can go. And we trust our people, and we get called in, but we also trust that they're going to follow the guidelines.
Yeah. So at Intel for many years, we had a blacklisting approach, and we were very generous. We only blacklisted porn, gambling, and known illegal sites. And everything else you could do. As cyber has become more and more pervasive, harder and harder to detect in your enterprise, and we've all been breached, so whether we know it or not, we've all been breached. So a couple years ago, we went to a whitelisting approach. So we whitelist all of our applications, so if they try to download something, it won't run on Intel. And we also encrypt our data, so if you try to take our data off, it will be encrypted and it won't run on another device. So it has forced us to get really quick at adding new applications to the whitelist. So we have to have sort of a week or less process. If somebody wants a new application, the first thing we do is we look in our catalog and see if we have an equivalent available today that they may not have known about, right? And we go that way. And we solve a lot that way by having a robust list already, for project management, note-taking, the kinds of things that you're seeing that people want to use, the consumer-oriented services. But if they don't, then we do a quick scan of the environment to see, how many people might use that, and we quickly go off and assess that. We give them a time period where they can use a free license, and then we go after an enterprise license for it. So we've had to become much more responsive as we've moved to whitelisting. And honestly, I don't get any complaints about it now. But we're pretty quick, and we're very clear about our turnaround, our commitment to turnaround and evaluation. But it's mostly we cover it because we have that robust set of applications that we're always scanning the environment for.
So we see innovation in multiple layers. These are two categories that I'll tell you is innovation to learn. It's purely learn. I mean, there's so much out there that you can learn from and just see practices, and then things as innovation to then deploy. And with and we have a small process that it takes less than a week to just understand what the innovation is going to be. And then if the innovation is ready, is innovate to deploy, there's more stakeholders that get invited to that conversation, and there's more rigor about what do we do with data. So we had a problem. We had a great example, a staff planning tool. So the business wanted to try it. So what we did is we used masking of data technologies, and we just gave them that data and said, here, try it with this data. And we gave them a masking data, so nobody could see it. They can still look at the product. They can play with the product. They loved it. But then the legal department said, you cannot use because of other reasons. But at least we learned what the tool could do and what was the ultimately solution that they wanted, and we can learn from it. What we also learned is that, on the other hand, with one of the venture capitalists, there is this company that is helping or is creating security signatures for cloud vendors. So what we did is to put them both together and said, can you please provide us a signature for this vendor? And they're working on how to then have our data go through that security vendor, encrypted, store it in their solution, but we will see it in a clear fashion. So this is the way that you can innovate. If you're going to learn, I think you need to just let it go and just be within your house. But if it's going to learn to deploy, your guardrails need to be a little bit tighter.
Okay, so we're down to our last few minutes. So I want to do a speed round. Lots of debate in the industry whether the CIO role continues to exist. Some say it's going to evolve to Chief Integration Officer, Chief Innovation Officer. Some finally think that information is finally going to happen because of our data capabilities. So, yes or no, does the CIO role exist in 5 years, or does it morph to one of the other common names? So, Cesar,
So I think it stays, but it's not the same CIO role that we see today. We see a more business-oriented, different skills that we see today.
I see it as also morphing, and I think that whether you've used integration, I use a word called orchestration. So I think that they're going to see is an inevitable march as we move things to the cloud, other services, that the role of what the head of a technology function for a company is going to be doing is going to be different in the future.
Yes, I think it's still here, but I agree with the other two comments. It evolves. I think whatever it evolves into in the context of your industry, your company, I think it definitely increases our efforts around integration and innovation, but it's going to vary by industry.
So I agree with everything everybody said, so I'll add something a little different. I think your good CIOs that actually help change the business to generate revenue in different ways will become the CEOs of the future.
So, and I will add that I believe the role of the CIO takes on a much more strategic value to the company to help set strategy and execute the strategy, as well as run the company efficiently. Without running well, you don't create any value. And in addition to the CEO capability, you're seeing more and more technologists, CIOs, CTOs, being added to boards of directors, because the governance of the company is required that you understand technology if it's core to your strategy. So my view is the future is very bright for people with technology backgrounds, and we have the ability to make fundamentally strategic impacts on all of our companies. So with that, we thank you for joining, and hopefully you had a good day.